sorry for those of you out on the live stream. I just said many brilliant things and cannot repeat them all. But again, I'm Jenna Conway. I'm standing in for Secretary Gadara and State Superintendent Gullickson as they are at lab school openings and board meetings this morning. We have a ton of excitement coming off last month's meeting on childcare and economic development. And excitement is also building as we prepare at the department for the rollout of this year's VQB5 profiles, which will come in that second week of October. So big announcements to come, but basically a significant amount of work was done last year to measure and improve the quality of experiences across our 3,400 public-private sites and the 12,000 classrooms that they contain. We are not yet, all that information is still embargoed, but will just be another exciting moment for early childhood. As you heard we talk about in this group, celebrating historic access highs in terms of kids and families having access to high quality options, and then a second year of being able to show those results with improvement across the board for the Commonwealth. So with that welcome, I am very pleased to turn it over to Delegate Carrie Coiner.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here with you all again, officially calling this meeting to order. And before we get started, I wanted to put out a few housekeeping items. I don't know if they'll go up on the screen or not. If you've been in the Patrick Henry building before, usually there's access to restrooms out this way. They are not accessible today. So if you want to head out to the lobby and just ask the kind folks who are at our security table, they'll direct you to the nearest restroom that you can use. And there's also the market that's out there if you need anything in the meantime. Or if you have any questions, stop anybody in the back area of the room, we'll be able to help. We do have quite a few commission members who are participating virtually today. I'd remind everyone who's online with us, we do have amazing support staff in the room who is monitoring those chat boxes, like when you said you couldn't hear anything, and they were able to get on that. Please put questions, comments in the chat, and know that your participation is felt here in the room as well. As always, we start with grounding ourselves in the Commission's charge, which is to provide feedback for recommendations for and track progress on the financing of a comprehensive birth to 5 early childhood care and education system. We work really hard in this group to move forward with stable, high quality early childhood care and education services for families who need them the most, empowering parents with choices that meet their needs and preferences and support both school readiness and workforce participation. Today's meeting will be full of information central to that charge and the many issues we have grappled with as the Commission so far this year. So to start us off, our facilitator, Elliot, will introduce 2 of the bills assigned to the Commission before we hear reports out from the House Bill 2538 work group and the House Bill 1959 work group. So we'll hear reports from both of those. After lunch, we will hear from the Children's Funding Project about how other states are funding their early childhood systems and options for what that could look like in Virginia. And to close out the day, we'll provide an update on the Commission's annual report, which is due October 1st. Which is right around the corner, y'all. I am thankful maybe for some cooler days, and we'll leave time for public comment at the end as well. So with that, I'm going to take roll call. As I call your name, please reply here if you are in the room. For those attending on Zoom, as a reminder, we will need you to unmute, reply here, and then also provide us with the location from which you are joining us. All right, Delegate David Bulova. Delegate Ellen Campbell.
Here from Waynesboro, Virginia.
Delegate Mike Cherry. Here. Delegate Carrie Coiner. Here. Delegate Cliff Hayes. Senator Adam Eben.
Here in Alexandria, Virginia.
Senator Mamie Locke. Senator Bill Stanley. Senator David Suederlein. Chief Deputy Secretary of Education, Emily Ann Gullickson, or Delegate. Thank you, Jenna. Secretary of Labor, Brian Slater, or Delegate Billy Reed. Department of Social Services, Commissioner Kevin Erskine. Ashley Allen. Belinda Astraw. Jason L. Kuby or Delegate Megan Healy? Simon Fiskus,
Here, Madison, Virginia.
Shakiva Frazier, Kathy Glazer, Edmund Hughes, Kristen Kane, Erica Knowles, Kayla LaFawn, Ken Nicely,
Here from Murdoch County.
Todd Norris, Nicholas Palacio,
Here from Stanton, Virginia.
Jenny Poor,
Here from Chesterfield, Virginia.
Stacy Parham, Benita Petrella,
Here from Summerville, North Carolina.
John Saleh, Travis Staten,
Here from Abingdon, Virginia.
Gary Thompson, Kevin Waddles, Rachel Williams, Elizabeth Randall Winkle. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to our facilitator. Thank you, Elliot.
All right. Well, thank you to both Jenna and Delegate Coiner. We have a lot of good stuff going on today. So as a reminder, the commission received referrals to review and report on several bills from the 2025 session and was charged in budget language with to review revised attendance requirements for the child care subsidy program, mixed delivery, and the Virginia Preschool Initiative, and to review and recommend adjustments to CCSB reimbursement rates for school-age childcare. We will focus on the attendance and school-age childcare responsibilities at our October meeting. Today, we're going to focus on the bill referrals. So, and I'm going to read this to make sure I get it exactly right. From a letter dated March 7th, 2025 from the Clerk of the Senate, the referral language says the following. This is to inform you that pursuant to Rule 20-0 of the Rules of the Senate of Virginia, the Senate Committee on Finance and Appropriations has referred the subject matter contained in House Bills 1959, 1972, and 2538 to the Commission on Early Childhood Care and Education for study. It is requested that the appropriate committee chair and bill patrons receive written reports with copies to this office by November 1st, 2025. Rule 20-0 of the Rules of the Senate of Virginia says that a committee may refer the subject matter of a bill or resolution to any agency, board, commission, council, or other governmental or non-governmental entity for comment. Good thing I went to law school to be able to process all that. Important thing though is for the purposes of the commission, right, the charge was to study and not necessarily to recommend yay or nay. And indeed, our practice historically has been to offer context and thoughts back to the General Assembly, but not to specifically recommend like, yes, you should pass this or no, you shouldn't. So we did create work groups to study these bills and report back to the full commission, and facilitating the process for the commission of offering comment by November 1st. You may remember you were given the opportunity to join one of those work groups in our first meeting of the year, and we're grateful to those of you who did. Today, the full commission will have the chance to hear updates from two of those groups. First, we will hear from the work group for House Bill 2538, which was sponsored by Delegate Bulva. That would establish and maintain a funding formula for the provision of early childhood care and education services. Then we will hear from the group that met to consider HB 1959, sponsored by Delegate Elizabeth Bennett Parker, which would add a 7th priority group to the child care subsidy program waiting list for families with a parent who is employed by a publicly funded child care provider. After each update, we will reserve some time for questions and discussion to inform any further work that may be needed prior to the report deadline. So I encourage you, as you're listening, to write down any comments you have, any questions you have, any requests for additional information you have, and there will be time to go into discussion about that. So with that, I am happy to turn it over to Delegate Bulva to talk about the HB 2538 work group.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Elliot. And good morning, everybody. So actually this room brings back some pretty incredible memories. And I don't know if there's anybody in this room who went all the way back to 2006. But when I first joined the General Assembly, we did not convene over in the Capitol. That was under restoration. And so this was the House chambers. And so for the first 2 years of my legislative career, I sat over there in that corner and learned the ropes. Right where I'm standing here today was the speaker's dais. And the reason you can tell this is the speaker's dais because of the very fancy semicircle behind me. So that was decorative in order to go ahead and show the awesome power of the speaker. But anyways, really nice to be back in this space. So am pleased to provide a report out on our House Bill 2538 work group. And as Elliot noted, this is really an opportunity for us to be able to provide an overview of our discussions, some of our initial findings, so that you have an opportunity to digest that information and then provide feedback before our November 1st report. I do want to give some kudos to Senator Mamie Locke. So I know this work group has the honorific of House Bill 2538. Actually, this was a joint effort between myself and Senator Mamie Locke. And so just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that she also had Senate Bill 756. And this was something that both of us worked on together during the 2025 session. So the intent behind the bill was to provide some consistency and some transparency with respect to how we fund the early childhood care and education system by requiring the development of a predictive formula. And so it sounded really, really simple, right? Well, almost. As we tackled the bill through this process, we needed to better articulate a couple of items as we started to dive into it. So first of all is why do we need to fire the current system? So why is the current system insufficient? What are the opportunity costs of continuing the status quo? So what happens if we do just kind of continue along our merry old way and don't make changes? And then at the end, what are the key components of that funding formula? And so those were the three things that we really is that it's really hampered by a couple of key gaps in right? So how do we better articulate increasing demand, but those services continue to cost money and change over time, and that's also not being reflected in our predictive modeling. And so what this can be seen in is the inability of a lot of eligible families, right? So these are families that have been determined to be eligible for access to services, but aren't able to achieve those services or reach those services, whether it's through the subsidy program, whether it's through the mixed delivery program, or whether it's through the Virginia Preschool Initiative. And so the intent of the legislation was to improve our ability to predict what that demand would look like by establishing a formula that was transparent, predictable, and tied to actual costs. Another kind of key thing, there we go. There we go. Wow, holy cow. All right, so another key thing that we did consider, and so there are a number of us on appropriations, is that we can't dictate through the funding formula that we will actually fund early childhood care and education systems at that amount, right? And so I think that's one of the issues that we ran into as we're going over to the Senate, was that ultimately we can provide a guide for appropriations and for legislators to make a decision, an informed decision, but we can't dictate that indeed we're going to fund it at a particular level. I will say, though, that it doesn't mean that this exercise isn't important. In fact, it's really, really important for us to understand what is that delta, what is that gap, because we don't want to be year after year funding at a certain level and not understanding, again, that there is a cost to that with respect to waiting lists. And so, again, we are cognizant that we're not making a decision about funding levels. We're making a decision tool in order to help legislators and appropriators make those informed decisions. So the work group met 4 times between July and September. This was definitely the coolest of the work groups to pick if you chose. We had a good time. Actually, it was they were very well organized, and we dove into a lot of different items. We also kept Jenna extraordinarily busy throughout her summer by requesting data from VDOE about the current state of the system, its impact on families and providers, the opportunity costs of inaction, and how a formula could align with the values defined by this commission. And so I'm hopeful that at some point, because I think the data that she provided is really great benchmark data and provides a really good picture of where the system is heading. And so I think that was valuable in its own right, and hopefully we'll be able to share a lot of the hard work that Jenna went ahead and provided to the work group. As a result of these meetings, though, we identified 3 major components of a sustainable funding formula. So the first one was parent demand and choice. And so really the formula should be able to predict slot needs based on eligibility, right? And so what is the pool of people who are eligible, and understanding what that pool looks like. Parent choice, and so being grounded in that each family is going to be unique, and we need to ensure that a parent who wants to do mixed delivery can do mixed delivery as opposed to another model, and vice versa. And so we want to make sure that we've got adequate slots that best meet the needs of the family. And then also looking back on historic demands for care and education programs, right? And so, one of the things that I think was cool about the info that Jenna went ahead and provided was that in some respects, that historic demand does provide a good predictor for what that future demand is, with a good number of caveats. So it's not a straight line. It's not something that we can just take and say we're done with it, but it does provide a good baseline for where we're going. The second one was per child funding. And so the funding formula should quantify the per child costs across programs, should do that across age groups and regions, while also accounting for the full cost of providing high quality care and education. And so the bottom line on that one to remember is that we ought to account for the true cost of quality. And so for any of those of us who deal with costs of quality, whether it's an early childhood education or things like Medicaid programs, you understand that there is a cost to underfunding that cost of quality. And it's like squeezing a balloon because those costs ultimately go elsewhere. And then finally, economic development. So the formula should provide flexibility, and it should account for new economic development projects that may not be reflected in historic growth data, right? And so Virginia's economy is constantly changing. It's dynamic. We're seeing that with what's happening at the federal level, but we also see it when we got these really great announcements from VEDP, at the regional level where we're getting really cool jobs. And so we need to make sure that our funding formula takes all those things into account. So just wanted to take a few moments to review in a little bit more detail each of these components and why they are important to a funding formula. So with respect to parent demand and choice, and so even with the historic investments that we made to the system during the 2024 legislative session, and that was a joint effort between the administration and the General Assembly. I think we're all really, really proud of that. The demand for these services continues to grow, and it still exceeds the supply of public slots, right? And so this is observed through the Child Care Subsidy Program waitlist. And so we know that we are underfunding the system because we've got people who are eligible and they're not able to get into the door. And so as a result, for those of the individuals who can't get into a subsidized program, the unsubsidized programs are increasingly unaffordable, and instead parents simply opt to stay out of the workforce as a result. And in fact, oftentimes they have little choice but to be able to opt out of the workforce. The next one is per child funding. And so this is a really, really important factor, as I went ahead and mentioned, and I just wanted to provide a little bit more granularity on this. And so when we set these numbers, we originally set them at 75% of the cost of quality during the prior biennium. We did not touch these or update them in the fiscal year 25-26 biennium. And so unlike our public education programs, and that includes the Virginia Preschool Initiative, there is no set process for re-benchmarking these costs. And so as we know, with inflation, that means the purchasing power of that dollar goes down. And so what we're seeing is a widening discrepancy between publicly funded program where we do benchmarking, we try to take that very seriously, versus the private where we don't see that. And so there are consequences for our private childcare providers. So you can operate at a loss. That's usually not a good business model. You have to charge more, making childcare less affordable for families that are not eligible for subsidies. And so, you know, that way you're further squeezing middle-class families and making it harder for them. Or, and this is probably more often the case, is that they can't adequately compensate their staff. And so regarding that latter point, you know, we've discussed a number of times here at these meetings that undercompensation results in very, very high turnover rates and inconsistency and shortages in caregivers. And so again, you know, there's a consequence for not re-benchmarking. And so one of our findings or initial findings out of our work group is that for private sites, again, they are subject to the same kind of quality standards. They serve very similar populations as their public peers. They would also benefit from a re-benchmarking process, a formulaic way of re-benchmarking the cost of quality rates. And so this in turn would make wage increases by their employees much more possible. The last thing I wanted to mention is the economic development component. And so the system that we have, it's a lagging program, right? And so we don't have a good way of being able to look out into the sphere and say, hey, where is demand increasing because economic development is happening. And so in particular, we don't have the ability to forecast and readily allocate slots to underserved regions based on new employer and economic development projects. And so this presents challenges in particular to those who are looking to the state or to locate in the state. And so this is where some really good coordination with the Virginia Economic Development Partnership would be very, very useful. And I do know, having served or serving on the MEI Commission, that these are things that VEDP talks to prospective employers and businesses that are looking to come into the state. And it is a factor with respect to whether they're going to be here. The question is how do we translate those VEDP discussions, that VEDP forecasting, so that we capture that into a funding formula so that we're ahead of that wave rather than behind the wave and potentially risking losing some of these major investments. Just wanted to hit on a couple other considerations that came from the work group. So the first one is that the marketplace of providers is responsive to increases in publicly funded slots. That's really good news. And so I think, you know, one of the worst things that could happen is that we put money into additional slots and that we don't have the providers out there in order to be able to provide those services. And so one of the kind of key takeaways, and all of these, I'm going to give just Jenna an enormous amount of credit because she's the one who crunches this data. That's good, right? And so if we make those investments, the providers will come and they'll help fill up that gap. On the other side of that, though, is that low compensation and the lack of re-benchmarking is impacting the early childhood care and education workforce. And so a statistic that really kind of stuck out in my brain is that 29% of teachers at publicly funded early childhood education sites in Virginia left the field altogether between fall 2023 and spring 2024. That's just a huge turnover rate. And again, that has enormous opportunity costs and real costs for those providers as they have to continue to train new people that ultimately just walk right out the door. And then finally, workforce participation and early childhood care and education access are linked. And so what we've seen is the number of available slots has increased. Virginia saw a higher labor force participation rate and lower unemployment, right? And so again, early childhood care and education, if you're not able to find it, you have a higher propensity just to drop out of looking for a job. And so there is a relationship between those. So just to bottom line where we are, and then get your feedback. And so what the work group is recommending consideration is first codifying a funding formula that reflects the commission's values. So that includes quality and compensation, access and choice, value and return on investment, stability and funding, and child care as an economic development. And then second, that funding formula should account for eligibility criteria, so access, parent demand indicators, so choice and stability, per child cost of quality benchmarks, and then finally, economic development considerations. And then finally, and this was the part where I like to see things really detailed in black and white in legislation. Any legislation should be a guide, not bind appropriators' funding choices, and also be flexible enough for administrative adjustments, because I think it's unrealistic to say that we're going to capture all of those things into a piece of legislation. And if we did, we would probably come to regret it. So we want to provide just enough guidance that provides the administration and others to be able to develop a really robust funding formula while not locking them into something that ultimately might not be in our best interest. So Elliot, floor is yours.
All right, great. Everyone can hear me? The mic's working? Awesome. So what we're going to do now is first, if anyone has any questions for Delegate Bulova, would love to make sure, just clarifying questions or anything. We want to create a little bit of space for that. And then we're going to ask everyone to spend a few minutes reflecting on a relatively dense amount of material that you just presented, so that we can then come back and have a group conversation where we hear from you about your reactions, your questions, any more information that you think you need. Because of our setup in this room, we are not going to be doing small groups the way we sometimes do. So again, after we do questions for Delegate Bulova, we'll ask everyone to take a few minutes on their own, and then we'll come back together and talk about it as a full group. So did you have anything else you wanted to add? Or?
No, I was just going to say, I imagine the biggest question out there is why you didn't join this work group to begin with. But other than that, just lesson learned.
Right. These are things people can carry with them for next year, whatever work comes the commission's way. So before we give you a moment to reflect, any questions that you want to ask Delegate Bulova to help aid with your reflection? Hold on. Can you wait for the mic just so that the people online can get it? Rebecca is kind enough to mic run today.
You had mentioned a number of the early childhood workers that left, I think 2023. Could you repeat that number?
Yeah, so the statistic that I have, and Jenna's nodding that it's correct, and I didn't make it up, 29% of teachers at publicly funded early childhood care and education sites in Virginia left the field altogether between fall of 2023 and spring of 2024. And so working in the private sector, that would be devastating if we were to lose more than a quarter of our workforce and have to retrain up.
Right, thank you.
We know where they went. The question was, do we know where they went?
We do. So, and I think the important point on Delegate Bulova's citation here is this is not kind of year to year. This is literally, if we go out and we do these observations in the fall, they are not there in the spring. So like 2 to 5 months later, like you're seeing that level of turnover. In sharp contrast, in our school-based settings, like our Virginia Preschool Initiative, that's only a 5% difference in terms of the teacher who's there in the fall versus the spring. We do not have the data, John, for that specific group. This is hot off the presses data, but a prior year's study of where teachers went suggested that, upwards of 80 to 85% of them are going outside of the sector. So they're going into completely different sectors. Very few are switching within private childcare. Some might be going to schools, but the vast majority, the overwhelming majority are moving out of the sector with a UVA survey of where people went.
Great question.
Delegate Bulova, this is not a trick question for you. You have been such a champion for this issue around the funding formula. And just wanted to, I think, sometimes people hear the phrase of funding formula and what does that really have to do with, the price of tomatoes? So from your, championship of this and, all that you just learned through the work group activities and the summary that you just gave, what would you say is why should commission members pay attention to this and what's the importance of this, of getting this right?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, and maybe I'll answer it in two ways. And so I think the first one is that we talk about funding formulas, but at the end of the day, you're talking about eligible families who are actually relying on these services, right? And so it's very important that we understand how many actual families who are eligible aren't ultimately getting those services. And so that's kind of number one. I think number two, kind of speaking from a legislator standpoint, we often can't fully fund programs, but it really, really helps when we see a light at the end of the tunnel and we know what we're aiming for, right? That's been one of the big frustrations I've had with a lot of our healthcare programs is that it's really hard to get your arms around where we want to go. But if you boil it down a little bit, so okay, for the individuals with disabilities, being able to clear the priority one wait list. We know what that wait list is going to look like. For my own area of expertise, Chesapeake Bay restoration, we haven't met it, but we know what the end goal is. And so it's really important to know what that end goal is because it helps us to focus better on actually getting there rather than just kind of giving up and saying, well, we don't know where the heck we're doing, and so we're not going to make investments or we're just going to throw some money in there.
All right, why doesn't everyone take a couple of minutes to reflect with comments, questions, and more information they want to hear, and then we'll come back together as a group shortly. And I also want to make sure that if folks joining online have that opportunity too. But Delegate Bulova has presented where the work group is so far, but before the commission moves forward with anything, we want to make sure that we've heard from all of you and that if there are any other factors we should be taking into consideration, that we have that, have that on the table. So please take a moment and reflect on any additional questions or comments you have, and then we'll come back together in just a couple of minutes. Thank you, Delegate Bulova. All right, let's come back together. And I know I saw some questions going on the chat. And unfortunately, for those of us in the room, for those of you online, if you put a comment in the chat, it like pops up and then it disappears. So if folks online have questions, maybe let me start with those folks and pause if there's anyone who wants the floor to ask a question or make a comment.
Elliot?
And please just jump in.
It's Travis Staten. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not from Abington. Sorry, I can't be there today. Well, I just wanted to stress, and first of all, thanks to Delegate Belova and the team's work there. When we think about funding formula, the importance of this work in economic development, as well as supply building in rural communities, I think we are spot on in the right area. And I think your comments about looking at that end goal and where we want to go, we want Virginia to be the best place to live, work, raise a family. That labor force participation is extremely important. And one of those biggest barriers, in fact, is because of lack of supply. And when we're working in rural communities, I mean, even thinking about the announcements in Southern Virginia to bring in higher paying, bigger jobs in these communities, when we still have lack of supply, that's hindering that labor force participation. So I think where we are looking at in the economic development arena and having funding and resources available to couple with those projects and those recruitments and those initiatives with BEDP is going to be extremely important.
Thank you. It looked like there were some other questions that came up online.
Yes. So Jenny Poor had asked for clarification around the turnover rate fall to spring for centers compared to public school educators, and then had a follow-up question about the average pay differences between those two sectors. So I'm going to hand it to Jenna to respond.
So the data that we shared with Delegate Bolova and the funding formula work group that shared that revealed this very stark difference between fall to spring turnover from last year when you looked at child care centers as compared to public schools, that the child care wages for the group that left were about $17 an hour compared to the school-based wages that were between $28 and $32 an hour. So that there seemed to be potentially a relationship between significantly higher rates of within year, right, between October and as early as sort of February, March, with these pretty stark differences in wages.
Thank you. Other questions from either online or in the room? Comments or thoughts, additional information that people want?
Thanks. Just to build on what Travis was saying a little bit, and first of all, thank you to everybody who was involved in this for the really comprehensive, great job, I think, that was done in capturing the issues and the way that they were articulated. I think the outline of the way to approach the formula is spot on. And I think there are parts of it that are inherently more challenging than others. And one of those, as Travis brought up, is the economic development component of it. How do you account for that element of it effectively? And, sort of speaking for all the rural areas of the state, one of the issues there is that where workforce participation is very low, I think we have to take that somehow into consideration as an opportunity, because in those areas where historically childcare has not been available, center-based childcare has not been available, and childcare subsidy therefore has not been available, there's really not a cultural knowledge that accessibility is possible. And so if we just look at the wait list as a measure of need and parent demand, we could be missing a significant amount of economic development opportunity in being able to address those low levels of workforce participation. So if there can be, I kind of think of that as childcare economic opportunity zones that maybe could be addressed in some special way that's not quite formulaic.
It's a really interesting and important point, and I think is probably tied up with the issue we flagged relating to how specific you want the legislature to be as opposed to giving administrative flexibility, right? Because some of those complex situations, the question of how much should the bill codify, how much should any bill codify about dealing with that, and how much should it charge the administration with dealing with it? Those are nuanced conversations that presumably need to be had, but that it's important to flag where some of these challenges lie, for sure.
I'd also just to both Travis and Todd's point, one of the things is the delegate mentioned when we look at sort of whether it's opportunities or opportunity costs, what we saw in the period where there was greater opportunity, a pretty significant growth rate, that there was a concurrent increase in supply. And so we had, when you look at the data, and it was both a function of more childcare providers being willing to take childcare subsidy, and the childcare providers that were taking subsidy serving more kids, right? So the kind of, it was these things, there's interplay between these factors around economic development. And then as Delegate Bulova noted, we also then saw workforce participation go up and unemployment go down, right? And all these things seem to move together. To your point about rural communities, one of the things we asked the team to look right before the funding formula work group meeting at, well, is this also true for family childcare, right? Which we know has from some niche locations, military and Tidewater, our folks who are speaking languages other than English in Northern Virginia, and is a really important source of childcare in rural and Southwest Virginia. And we saw the same trend without any sort of direct government-led incentive, that there are more family childcare providers that sort of came online during this period of growth, and that there are more kids per family childcare provider, right? So there's something around accounting for growth in this formula that then cues or results in the supply side acting differently. And I think Southwest Virginia experienced the opposite of that when we were no longer able to grow and we had to move to the wait list, and there was real friction where folks were ready to come online and there was not a capacity, whether that's a small family childcare or a larger childcare center. So as we looked at this data over this period and we had this sort of distinct shift in opportunity, looking on both sides of that cut point really showed what you and Travis just described as happening on the ground and needing to account for growth if you want to account for economic opportunity.
Great. I'm Megan Healy at VDP, and I love the economic development conversation. I love childcare, so I love that this merges in my job. You know, in Virginia, actually 68% of our growth is our current businesses. It's not, you think about we're attracting all these jobs, but it's actually really supporting the jobs we have and trying to grow them and grow our companies. And then now we're actually, with the economics, we're watching just retention of companies, right? That's just as important. They might not add a couple of people, but we just want them to stay here in Virginia. And so this conversation is really important because we know businesses reach out to me every day. I would love to stay here in Virginia. I'd like to grow in Virginia, but I can't find the workforce. And making sure that we have childcare options to bring people off the sidelines to get into these jobs. It's a cycle we all have been talking about for years. So I'm excited about this conversation, but I do hear over and over again from our businesses can't grow because they don't have the workers. They don't have the workers because they don't have childcare.
Other comments, thoughts, questions, concerns? This has been super helpful. All right, well, if that is what folks have to say, that's very helpful, and certainly appreciate the comments about both maintaining the childcare workforce and the role of early care and education in supporting Virginia's larger workforce. So thank you for all those comments, and we will work on incorporating those into the report that is due November 1st. And so with that, we will now hear from the HB 1959 work group, and I will turn it to Delegate Campbell.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here today. So I'm here to talk to you today about Delegate Elizabeth Bennett Parker's HB 1959. Our work group looked at this and Her bill would require that the Department of Education would amend the Virginia Child Care Credit Subsidy Guidance Manual to create a new priority group on the waiting list for children of parents who are employed for at least 30 hours a week at a publicly funded child care provider. It would exclude employment at local school divisions, but it would include employment for a Head Start program that is located within the school. Currently, we have 6 different subsidies within the provision. One is the family unit that has a child that has special needs for whose services are requested. The other is a family with a child experiencing homelessness, families involved in CPS or foster care prevention, and families that include minor parent under the age of 18 in high school whose child will be receiving a subsidy service. Also, we have emancipated teen parent groups that are younger than 18 in high school, and their case has been dismissed due to lack of funds. The way it works now is our families are placed on a waiting list by waiting list priority and the waiting list screening and application date. These are the 6 groups that I just talked about in which they are grouped together and placed at the beginning of the waiting list. Within the priority group, the families will be ordered, placed based on application and screening dates. Families would already have to meet the qualifications of the CCSP, so it's not going to extend any benefits to any families that would not otherwise be qualified. The bill is intended to address the recruitment and retention of early child care educators in Virginia by prioritizing their access to the child care subsidy program when there's a wait list. The work group talked about different things within this. We discussed the fact that, we do know, and we talked about it already this morning, that our educators are paid low wages and some of them lack benefits. But there were some concerns that it could be perpetuating the normalization of subpar wages for early education educators. And the group decided that there's a couple things that we should consider. We should explore the fiscal and operational implications of prioritizing our early educators for subsidy. We can consider the structural solutions like a cost of quality methodology to set reimbursement rates that would allow for competitive compensation and long-term workforce sustainability. And of course, we always want to make sure that we maintain an open dialogue with certainly the delegate who proposed the legislation, as well as people that have different stakeholders within the conversation.
All right, thanks, Delegate Campbell. And would now ask if any folks in the room have any questions for Delegate Campbell that they want to ask. And if not, hopefully people have been taking down comments and questions. If we want to just get into, would love to hear if folks have any reactions or questions or more information that they would like to hear.
Thank you, Elliot. And this might be a question for Jenna. But I agree with Delegate Campbell. We don't want to normalize, low pay for our providers and do this and somehow think that we've solved the issue. I guess so. My question is, what is the value? What would the value of being able to get this subsidy be for a provider? And so, and especially compared to increasing compensation kind of the old-fashioned way incrementally. And so I don't want to discount that this actually could have quite a value. And while we don't want to send a signal that all of these individuals, because not all of them are going to have kids who would be eligible, and so we've still got that problem. It still could be a powerful economic jumpstart or budgetary jumpstart to get some more people in.
So I think the important point to note up front is that the vast majority of childcare teachers currently in the Commonwealth are probably economically eligible, right? It would depend on their family structure, but likely already economically eligible for childcare subsidy under our current eligibility cutoffs, right? So just in terms of like, as you think about valuation. Something becomes most valuable, right, if otherwise you could not afford it, right? So for this particular proposal, this moves you potentially closer to the front of the line. So it's more of a like timing issue in terms of that. Unfortunately, we do not have the granular data on how many childcare teachers are on the wait list as compared to actively accessing. We know we have a significant number we've looked at. We remember, my favorite open-ended field in our data system is that employer. And so we know there's lots of ways to spell Goddard, but we know that there's a significant number of childcare teachers who already benefit. I think when we've had this conversation, if you were to change the eligibility levels, that might make sort of more upper income childcare teachers eligible. That probably doesn't make sense, right? Based on some of the conversations that we had last year. There is a value, I think, as Benita Petrella has talked about, around even sort of making it easier for childcare teachers to get it. And that could also encourage programs to become publicly funded. The delegate did add some of that same language around making sure that we were elevating publicly funded programs as the priority for this. But this is really just a moving to the front of the line for already eligible folks. So it is hard to quantify, delegate, like a precise dollar value there.
Other questions, comments, requests for more information?
This goes back to the open text box for the employer. Is there anything in the works to potentially change that to so that we can get this data? Like a box like, are you currently a child care provider? Or are you currently serving in the military? Like those types of things changing to that intake form for the subsidies so that we can make more of these decisions to move it up.
I should probably turn this over to Kevin down there at the end, but I'll spare him the pain. So I think there could be a recommendation from this body to sort of look more broadly at the employer. I would encourage us not to just sort of add a field here or there. This is the Virginia Case Management System, which is the system for food assistance, for health insurance eligibility. One change costs us lots and lots of money. And so we want to be sort of prudent about that. I think in terms of some of the recommendations of this body, if there were a desire to say, going back to Todd and Travis's comments, right, like we need to get a better handle of, to what extent is the child care subsidy program and how is it supporting the Virginia economy? Taking a look at that and thinking about what changes that might mean to the system would be worth it. But it would, I think we'd want to really think through how to do that and how to do that affordably. When Delegate Campbell spoke earlier about some of the costs of some of these changes, even though, as I just noted to Delegate Bulova, there's not necessarily a financial value in moving somebody to the top of the wait list, that still requires us to reprogram a system that serves hundreds of thousands of Virginians every day, right? Which into the, as we've seen in some of the policy shifts in recent year, can cost the state hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so we're also wanting to kind of account for how do we make really strategic changes. But I do think coupling your comment with the enthusiasm heard from this body around when we looked at the employers, and again, the realization, when I speak nationally, I often share that, to see that data, that child care subsidy is supporting 100 of our 130 school divisions is really provokes thought around, okay, how is child care subsidy supporting government, supporting economy, as Megan talked about, supporting kind of existing employers, and having more detailed specific data on that could really help, I think, multiple purposes. So we would certainly be open to that type of recommendation.
So we did actually make a change in the system recently to collect the sector that the head of household works in. We've always collected military status. That's data we can pull at any time. But we are now collecting sort of the bigger bucket of the kind of category of employment for the employer. We have not analyzed that data yet because it was put into effect in the system, but parents have to answer that question. And so it was sort of coming up on a rolling basis as families redetermined their eligibility or applied for the first time. We're coming up on having that in the system for about a year now, and so we should be able to get a better picture of the totality of families enrolled, but it'll make the kind of analysis that we did that Jenna likes to talk about much easier for us to do in the future.
Thank you. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Just something to consider from the perspective of a childcare operator. So first of all, what we're discussing has dual benefit, right? Because it helps Virginia families who need subsidy, but it also helps to stabilize childcare, which is extremely important. And we're seeing this more and more. This retention issue is becoming a huge problem. And wages calibrated in Southwest Virginia to lower rates than the $17 that you were talking about for teaching assistants. And so that, but that competitive issue is still there when people can get jobs at, fast food or Target that are paying more. And, for us, it also relates to the healthcare workforce and what we're able to pay certified nursing assistants, for example. But there may be something to consider because this would provide such benefit to childcare operators. There may be a way for them to have some skin in the game that that wouldn't put if you get to a place where it's difficult to justify 100% funding or 100% prioritization, there could be a matching component from centers that would be beneficial in the subsidy consideration or prioritization for childcare workers. So that's just something to think about that may stretch the dollars more across and provide more benefit across more childcare workers.
Perhaps data to collect would on the exit interviews as people are leaving is whether or not they have preschool age children. If they have children birth to 5 is probably a better question to find out, because at least I'll say anecdotally from where I live, what I hear from providers are they already provide benefits, either discounts or your child is able to attend at no cost to those who are working there. It's the people who don't have children who are choosing to leave because they don't need that benefit and they can make more money elsewhere. So, I think in terms of looking at, we already have a pretty substantial priority list and we can't even serve everybody on that priority list. And it seems like our child care and education industry is doing what we're asking other industries to do, which is provide benefits related to childcare for your employees. They're probably doing it a little bit more than other industries. But it seems like it's, at least in my community, it's the people working in the industry who don't have children who find better pay somewhere else.
Other questions and thoughts? These are some good requests for additional data and additional context as we continue to wrestle with this issue. Clear that there are other things that people want to know.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe a question for Jenna or somebody else from the team, because I know that the way the bill is, or the legislation was set up, it's a way to retain people who are already doing that. And so that's going to be a relatively small universe, I think. I guess, and perhaps, we've already touched on this a little bit. How complicated would it be to take this from a retention tool to a recruitment tool, right? And so, if we have a lot of turnover and we're looking to see how we can get more providers into the system, it very well may be kind of that fear of being placed on a waiting list that is keeping somebody from jumping in. And so from an equity standpoint, I don't think we would want to say that, we wouldn't address those who are already working and make sure that they get those supports. But I'm curious how complicated or what your thoughts are on expanding this to be, hey, if you are willing to commit to 30 hours a week, can we do that? And would that be more effective in terms of bringing in more providers who might otherwise be, nervous about doing that now?
So I would say that if we were to look back at all of the various workforce data points, the surveys, all the work we've done with UVA, the work around Recognized B5, that it is very hard to successfully execute really precise policy solutions like that across 3,000 sites, 12,000 classrooms, and all of the different range of private providers, right? And so with every sort of level of specificity, it becomes harder to do that, harder to execute that, sort of hard to sort of think through, okay, what are the implications for our 120 local offices that are then sort of saying, like, who are they being prioritized above? And you sort of heard from Delegate Campbell, these are all pretty pronounced need groups. And I think the other stat, and I believe you asked me about this stat last year on this time, Delegate, is that we're still only moving very, very small numbers of people off the wait list each month, right? We were 14,000 deep on it, of which sort of 8,000 plus are birth to 5. And, it's in the single digit percentage of who's actually moving off versus the folks who are instead, often giving up and opting out that. So, I think you'd want to, and the department could help with this, you would sort of account for the technology costs. You would think about the operational implications of implementing across 120 offices. And I'm not sure that our 3,000 providers would see much bang for a buck across the system, right? Versus tackling what we've seen, some of the more fundamental inputs, the rates, kind of thinking about kind of the access, accounting for growth seems to be a more effective lever if you were to look back over the last few years than say something this precise and specific.
And just to note that Delegate Campbell did indicate in the chat that she is hearing kind of similar themes in her community that Delegate Coiner was just sharing around providers in that area offering this benefit to their staff.
Thank you. Anyone else online? I know we've had some robust comments in the room and just want to make sure we're not missing anything from our remote participants. Anything else from the folks in the room? This has been very helpful. All right, well, thank you all for those comments, and that this, obviously some of the questions people had about more information they would like to see and to try to understand the impacts this will have on recruitment and retention are very helpful. And again, we'll be working to finalize those recommendations and getting them out by November 1st. As lively as those conversations were, we are ahead of schedule because we anticipated potentially. Well, I will say that I think we're on schedule in part, ahead of schedule in part because the work groups did such thorough jobs that while folks had some very good questions and things to add, that we were not starting from zero. And so Delegate Bulova spoke earlier of the awesome power conferred by the little semicircle over my head. And what I'm going to do now is use that awesome power to rearrange the agenda a little bit. Because the next two things on our agenda are lunch, which is not here yet, and it's also a little early, and a speaker, a presentation about from the Children's Funding Project, and I believe they may not be joining us until closer to their appointed time. So with that, we will jump ahead, and I will turn it over to Delegate Coiner to talk about the Commission's annual report.
All right, back on. Okay. So each year we have our annual report due to the General Assembly by October 1st. We were a little rushed last year. So we're growing. So we have a better job. We have time today to kind of go over it. As you may recall, this report enables us to share what we have learned, what we value, and what we want to be the priorities for the early childhood system as we move forward. Historically, we have gathered inputs through your comments, Post-it notes, drawings, all the activities that we've done throughout the year, and that helps us turn it into a written report. We rely on the steering committee to finalize that report since we don't have another meeting between today and the time that that's due. And it ensures that we get that report timely to the General Assembly. So before wrapping up today, we wanted to make sure before we end and we all leave that there's time to provide a summary of what has been recorded so far so that we are all on the same page. So I'm going to go through what we anticipate the sections are going to be in our report. I'm going to pause at each section. If something doesn't have clarity or if you think we're missing something, this is our opportunity, our last opportunity to ask questions or to make changes, okay? So we have 4 key values. We've already discussed 2 of those. So here are the 2 that we have not explicitly discussed yet today. The first one is access and choice. So in our report, that's one of our values. And under that, these are the takeaways from our work this year that we anticipate being part of that report under access and choice. Parents have a wide range of high quality, affordable public and private options that meets their needs and account for family preferences. Everybody thumbs up, clear? Good, okay. Transparent and quality data is used to facilitate family decisions and communicate the benefits of ECCE to parents and communities. See lots of head nods, okay. Funding follows children, not systems, and working families with birth to 5 children are prioritized for publicly funded full-day, full-year options. Okay. And the last bullet point, providers and business partners are incentivized and granted the flexibility required to build and expand supply. Those are our full 4 main values for access and choice. Yes, thank you, Jenna. Oh, thank you. It's broken up into different pages. Thank you. All right, so we have, all right, so childcare should be recognized as essential to Virginia's economy. Shortages are an economic development and growth problem as they create barriers to workforce participation. Sound accurate? Okay. Ongoing growth in public investments and ECCE driven by family demand fuel economic growth by increasing the supply of ECCE, mitigating childcare access as a barrier to workforce participation for parents, and making Virginia communities attractive for new employers. Priority. Yes? Okay. And the last one in this one, local and state government, businesses, and communities collaborate to develop and implement innovative solutions that fit individual community needs. Great. All right. In addition, we have this charge written in the state code that asks us to make recommendations on how to finance a comprehensive birth to 5 early childhood care and education system. So this group, again, over the course of the year, noted the importance of funding stability and sustainability. So that's the next section of things that we value. And these are the 2 bullet points underneath that. Virginia's ECCE system should be supported through sustainable funding streams that allow for flexibility and alignment with parent demand. Does that sound accurate in that space? Clear to everybody? Okay. And the second bullet point is that Virginia's ECCE system should support through multiple different funding sources, including local, state, federal, and private sources. Okay, head nods on that. All right, so both of those will be reflected in our report. Now back to the other pages where I was. All right. The last one of that, we have the quality and educator compensation as one of the things that we say is important as a value. And there are 2 bullet points under here. Early childhood educators are recognized as valuable professionals with compensation and professional development opportunities that reflect the significance of their work. Sound like a good summary of our bullets from there? Okay, awesome. And then ECCE programs are reimbursed at the true cost of care, supporting competitive compensation for early childhood educators, and in turn, improving workforce recruitment, retention, and quality of learning experiences. Yes. We need a microphone so that the online people can hear you. I'm sorry, John, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I'm just wondering how's our up-to-date data on what is the real cost of having a child on child care in Virginia from 0 to 5 and quality care that people's preference would be suitable for them. I mean, that's the bar we're looking for. And, you know, where's the money going to come from? And I know that might be a hard stat to pull out of your hat, but it'd be nice to have it.
Yeah, no, of course, that's not surprising, John. So, we can certainly pull it. You know, the averages can be a little bit deceptive, right? I mean, infant and toddler care are more expensive, right? Because they're more labor intensive. Again, I had this conversation on the side of a soccer field this weekend when a parent was like, why is it so expensive? And I said, well, think about your first graders class. And she says, yes, how many in there? And she said, 21 kids. I was like, would you be comfortable walking into a room where there are 21 infants with, 1 educator? She says, no. So I said, that's why childcare is so expensive. We can pull for you that information. We shared with the funding formula work group that it has gotten more expensive in recent years as the sector has tried to respond to the need to pay teachers more. And the good news is that teachers are paid more than they are a few years ago. As Todd noted, there's a pretty significant range here from kind of what wages are in Southwest Virginia as compared to Northern Virginia. But we'll pull those numbers. My sense is the slide that this group also loved, we've updated recently, is probably it's still more expensive than higher education, your public higher education in most areas of the state. When you think about infant, toddler, and 2 years of preschool, it is potentially, certainly in Delegate Boliva's neck of the woods, it could be up there.
Any other questions? Comments on that section? All right, so we have access and choice, excuse me, quality and educator compensation, funding stability and sustainability, and childcare as economic development. Those are the 4 things. And we're going to, with another presentation, since we rearranged the schedule, spend more time delving into the funding stability and sustainability conversation, just being moved to after lunch. So these are the things that we've discussed over the summer and into the fall now. And so those are the shared values that will go into the final report that will be presented by October 1st. Everybody good? Okay, awesome. All right. We've also translated these values into action. And so as a body, we've developed a set of priorities. And as we've listened all summer, we've gone through and set out and developed those strategic priorities into action. And so the 5 high-level priorities that will be in the report. So this is part 2 of our report. The first is use family demand and choice to drive funding slots. Virginia should continue to maximize all available public and private funding sources and explore new sustainable and innovative funding mechanisms outside of the general fund to systematically address family demand and preferences. So that's one of our priorities when we talk about what our 5 high-level priorities are. The second pursue public-private funding mechanisms, and that's where we should continue to leverage public and private financing mechanisms and explore innovative ways to finance the system, ensuring care is affordable and public dollars can accommodate increasing demand. The third in our 5 high-level priorities would be addressing workforce challenges. And so we should maintain and expand effective initiatives that directly address teacher shortages and other persistent workforce challenges that we see. So that's our third of our 5 high-level priorities. The fourth, streamlining regulations. And so it's been a while since we've had this conversation, but it's an important one to bring back. We should continue to simplify regulatory oversight and decrease unnecessary bureaucracy, ensuring a functional, diverse system that works for families and providers, and improve the business climate in the childcare industry, providing supply building and private investment, promoting supply building and private investment. The last area, our last meeting is what we spent most of our time talking about. Our final 5th one is promote early childhood as essential economic development. So remember, most of our last meeting was spent on this high-level priority. And those are things that could include, developing a playbook for businesses, for the chamber to use when they're out with folks, identifying incentives for business investment in early childhood, expanding cost-sharing models. A lot of those were the ideas around economic development. So we've done a lot. And just wanted to, at the end of this, affirm again our 4 values, our 5 high-level priorities. That will be what the steering committee takes and puts into that final report that will go out by October 1st. All thumbs up. Any questions? Okay. Well, then, thank you all for this section. I did want to share, since we have a little bit of time. Elliot, yeah, okay. So at the end of our last meeting, Delegate Bulova and I met with a group of providers from all over the Central Virginia region, childcare providers on a Zoom. And I happened to share with them that I had a mom who was experiencing homelessness and had gotten a job in one of our public schools, but didn't have housing and didn't have a car and didn't have childcare. And I said, how important what you all do is, because she's going to need affordable childcare. Well, one of those providers stepped up and provided her childcare, which is absolutely amazing. So I just wanted to read, because oftentimes we talk about slots and formulas, but an actual mom, and this was her thank you. She said, I want to personally thank everyone for that outpouring of love and support for myself and my little family. For months, I've searched and longed for any small glimpse of hope for our lives. And in a few short months of Mrs. I'll leave the teacher name blank, helping connect us to so many amazing people, tonight we get to lay down our heads in a place we finally call home. Excuse me. Never could I have imagined that God would find a way to bless us with caring souls who took time out of their lives to help us in so many aspects. But she has a newborn and a 3-year-old, and they're safe in childcare every day, and she's working in an elementary school, all because of childcare providers. And they stepped up to serve her in more ways than just giving her a slot in their childcare place. So a really good story. I just thought I would share from the great work that we're doing. It really does change lives. So thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Coiner. I'll come back to the front. The power stays with the semicircle. All right, so let's briefly recap where we are. We have gone over the annual report. And we'll, again, appreciate that everybody had a chance to, hear about what's going to be in that. If anyone has any additional thoughts at any point in the meeting, please let us know. Our afternoon presentation may bring up some issues that we end up wanting to incorporate in that, but otherwise, appreciate Delegate Coiner laying out the framework of that, and we will move forward along those lines. Presentation. The report on the referred bills we discussed today is due November 1st. And again, really grateful to everyone's feedback on that. Our reports on attendance requirements and school-age childcare are due December 1st, and that will be the subject of our October meeting. So lunch is here, as those of you in the room have seen. So we are going to now take a break and eat it. And then when we come back, we will be hearing from I want to make sure I get the title right. The Children's Finance Project. No, I'm not. Hold on. I'm so turned around in my notes that I don't have it. What? Children's Funding Project. All right, good. So we will be hearing from the Children's Funding Project after lunch, which I believe they will be on at noon. Or do we have an update on, do we know anything different on timing, or it'll be noon? All right, so we have a break for lunch. Enjoy. Reminder that the bathrooms are out and to the right, I believe, and then food is here for commission members and staff. And we will reconvene, for those of you online, we will reconvene at noon. Thanks very much, everybody.
Hopefully you are enjoying your lunch. Delegate Cherry was a good preschool friend, and I liked his pie better than mine. So he traded, like all good kids in school do, right? So I appreciate him being a good classmate. He's not even listening to me. Everybody's deciding what pie they got and where they liked it the best. All right. Well, as we come back together, we now have our next group that's joining us virtually. So thank you for your patience as we reordered the schedule earlier. So we're going to spend some time now brainstorming and considering potential approaches on how do we pay for and sustain the system that we've envisioned. So the Children's Funding Project is joining us virtually to share information about how other states are financing their systems and what options Virginia can leverage to get the full return on investment from our early childhood care and education investments. And with that, I will turn it over to the Children's Funding Project virtually joining us. Thank you.
Hey, sorry about that slight delay, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. No pie for me, unfortunately. So my name is Bruno Showers. I'm State Policy Manager at Children's Funding Project. And today I'll be talking about some of the ways that states dedicate funding to early care and education. And then maybe presenting some very preliminary ideas of what kind of revenue mechanisms Virginia might look into to do the same. So here at Children's Funding Project, just very briefly, we're a social impact organization that helps governments, foundations, nonprofits go through this process of what we call strategic public financing. And this is what that process looks like. So we'll help you figure out how much funding is going to the programs and services that you care about. Once you have that information, we can help you figure out how much more you need to spend to get where you want to go in terms of the metrics you care about for those programs and services, whether that's accessibility, affordability, etc. And then finally, my role is to help you figure out what revenue mechanisms might be available to you to help fill that gap. And so we know that states currently have limited funding dedicated to early care and education. It usually looks something like this. We know that private dollars play a role, but they're usually a much smaller piece of the pie. No pun intended, with public dollars making up most of the available revenue, but with the significant gap that we know that we need to fill. One reason for this is that early care and education, unlike something like K-12 education, for example, typically doesn't have a dedicated source of funding. So to understand where we might get new revenue, obviously we need to understand where our current revenue is coming from. And so ECE relies on a few different sources of revenue. Obviously, federal, state, and local governments all contribute, with private philanthropic dollars also playing a role. All of these additional sources of revenue are important, obviously, but today's conversation is going to focus on state revenue sources, candidly, because that's my wheelhouse. So prior to joining Children's Funding Project, I did state tax and budget policy in Arkansas, which is actually where I'm coming to you from today, the great city of North Little Rock. So that's why we'll be focusing on that today. Other parts of my team would be able to help with other parts of this menu of options. Just wanted to note that. So before I present this list of states that has a state dedicated funding mechanism, I think it makes sense to level set a little bit about what we mean. I think obviously we're talking about the state level, partially because it has more resources available than say local governments or private philanthropic dollars. We're talking about revenue that's dedicated. So for most of these examples that I'll be showing shortly, we're talking about something that's a specific revenue mechanism that's typically outside of the traditional budget process. So something where there's either a ballot initiative or legislation that specifically enumerates a source of revenue and its specified uses outside of that typical allocation process. And again, focusing, although there are a few of these funds do braid together private dollars with public dollars, and all of them allow for private contributions. Obviously, the vast majority of the revenue really does come from public dollars, public revenue mechanisms. So before showing the list of states that do these, that actually do this, I think it's worthwhile to talk about the revenue mechanisms that they currently rely on. So at least one state relies on a general sales tax to fund early care and education. That's South Carolina. 0.25% of their sales tax is dedicated to early care and education. And, sales tax is a tax on the consumption of goods or services as a percent of their sales price. Although, caveat, want to note there that I say goods or services. Typically, states don't tax all services the same way they do goods, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, but just wanted to flag that there. Another pretty common source of revenue are excise taxes. Several states rely on, these are taxes on specific goods or activities like tobacco products, marijuana and cannabis products, or sports gambling, casinos, those sorts of things. Sometimes they're referred to as sin taxes because of the sort of activities that they target. Another fairly common source of revenue for these things is public settlement agreements. I think obviously the book is closed on the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement by now, but there recently was an opioid settlement agreement. I'm not sure how those dollars have been allocated. And then there's an upcoming social media litigation, which I believe Virginia is a part of against Meta and other social media companies. And that might be a potential opportunity on the horizon. Another increasingly common kind of revenue mechanism states are relying on are taxes based on income in some way. So Vermont recently enacted a payroll tax, which is allocated to early care and education. And Washington State, although it doesn't even have a traditional personal income tax, enacted a capital gains tax that a portion of the revenues are dedicated to early care and education. Land trust funds. I think probably most people have heard about the New Mexico experience. I think that's the most common, most popular example of this one. So that's revenue from the leasing of public lands and resources, oil and gas being one of the biggest and one of the most common. Although there are other states that have used land trust funds. Nebraska is kind of a good example of that, as well as this last revenue mechanism I've identified on this slide. So in Nebraska, they used a one-time transfer from their land trust fund, as well as a match from private philanthropic dollars. And that created a fund that doesn't have an ongoing revenue stream, but they've allocated the interest generated from that to early care and education every year since then, being supplemented by general fund dollars at certain times. So all those revenue mechanisms in hand, I think we can kind of look at this timeline and understand it a little better. So we recently released a paper about just this topic. So if you're interested in more of the details of any of this, happy to share that information. But I think for our purposes here today, it's worth highlighting that, the oldest fund of this sort, the one that I mentioned in South Carolina, is over 40 years old. So this is like an old idea, not a new one. There's a lot of like geographical and political representation here. I think, it's not specific to any one kind of state or region. And most importantly, if you'll look, ever since Louisiana created theirs in 2017, each year since then, there's been at least one fund created that dedicates revenue to early care and education. So this is definitely a topic that we believe is gaining steam recently. As I mentioned, every year since 2017, at least one fund created for early care and education. Most recently, just this year, we saw Montana do something, Connecticut doing something the year before that. So, like I said, it's a trend that's gaining across the states, not specific to any one kind of region or political area, economics, anything like that. Also worth mentioning, I think here, that the revenue amounts from these really range wildly. So the most revenue generated for early care and education is probably Washington's capital gains tax, which in its first year raised almost $900 million for early care and education. Whereas that Nebraska fund that I mentioned, the interest generated from that initial creation is somewhere more like $2 million per year, which kind of shows you the trade-off between different types of revenue mechanisms. Just wanted to show, I think, a visual representation of what I was talking about. This is a map of all the different states that have state level dedicated funds of the sort that we're talking about today. Candidly, not all of these are for early care and education, although most of them are. And I would also say that as it pertains to revenue mechanism, it could be used for something else. And early care and education is as good of a use as anything, I think. So you could take learnings from other states, even if the programmatic uses aren't the same as the ones that you're looking at. And obviously, I think you can tell another thing from this map is that these things kind of trend. When sports betting becomes legal, sports betting becomes a source of revenue that's tapped for these things. When marijuana becomes legal, marijuana becomes a source of revenue that's tapped for these things. I mentioned the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. So we can just kind of see waves. Not every state fund follows that trend, but it's something that we can kind of see that, as new revenue comes online, that's often an opportunity for early care and education. I'm going to look at a couple of state profiles in particular, although I just wanted to note that, again, we recently released a publication on this. So if you're interested in much more in-depth information than what I'm able to share with you today, more about the history of the fund's creation and specific information about its programmatic uses, of which I'm not an expert, by the way. I'm the revenue guys. I'm the money side of things. So just wanted to clarify that I'll do my best if there's questions about programmatic uses, but that's also not my wheelhouse. But the paper does have that information. So definitely worth looking into. So one of the states that I wanted to highlight is the Louisiana fund that I mentioned earlier, for a couple of reasons. So one, Children's Funding Project was kind of involved or helped the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children get this idea off the ground. So we're proud of what they were able to achieve with our help. Although it has, this is a fund that has various sources of revenue, like 4 or 5 different ones. The vast majority of the revenue, 95+%, really does come from sports betting. 25% of the revenue from sports betting in Louisiana is dedicated to this fund, with the rest going to, various different funds, including the general fund and other special funds. The amount generated for early care and education, the most recent year of available data was 3.15 million. That's expected to go up because just this year they raised the rate of taxes on sports betting. So, because it's a share of the revenues that goes to early care and education, when that revenue stream increases, the revenue stream for early care and education also increases. In terms of the outcomes, slightly more than 2,000 children have been served in the most recent year of available data, but that's perhaps a little misleading until the way that this fund is structured is as a state local match. And so the state doesn't spend money unless localities put up a dollar to match that. And so until this most recent year, there wasn't enough interest, enough localities taking advantage of that to draw down all of the funding. That has changed as more localities. New Orleans was the only locality that took advantage of this for a few years. Now there's about a dozen localities, I think, that are doing it. And so as more interest is generated at the local level, more children are being served, but also more of the funding is being drawn down, and they're looking at more revenue streams, which is, one reason they raised the rates for sports betting, for example. Another example, I think, a bit of a more complicated beast is Maryland. So, look at that typo. This is another fund that has various revenue mechanisms tapped for it. Unlike Louisiana, there's not really one dominant one in the same way. Various revenue mechanisms here are meaningfully contributing to the dedicated fund. The amount generated is a little bit harder to target specifically for early care and education because the fund isn't specific to early care and education. That's just one portion of the funding of the fund. And that means that, so we know that about 252 million of this dedicated funding goes to early care and education, mostly to support 3 and 4-year-olds. But it's harder to attribute the exact outcomes to this funding stream because so many other funding streams are involved, because this funding stream is used for so many other reasons as well. To be clear, the overall amount generated is somewhere in the neighborhood of like $2 to $3 billion, but only about 10% of that goes to early care and education. I think another thing worth mentioning here, which maybe segues us into some ideas for Virginia. I mentioned sports betting, and that's all in Louisiana. That's also a source of revenue here. Sales and use tax, as I mentioned, in South Carolina. But also they kind of pioneered this digital advertising tax, which is essentially a tax on companies that have profits above a certain amount in Maryland from digital advertising. So this is, again, I think, I mentioned litigation against social media companies. I think this is supposed to be targeting that kind of rising issue with like youth social media use and those sorts of issues. And in fact, I think there's like a couple of states looking at that. So as I mentioned, those are the examples of states that have done something like this, the revenue mechanisms that they've utilized, the timeline of when they did so. And then here I've created, as I mentioned, these are just ideas, not all of them would have trade-offs, like different reasons that you might look at them versus other sources, depending on how much revenue you want to raise, just various what your values are. But these are just some ideas of opportunities that might be theoretically available in Virginia. And so here I've listed out like the ideas, the description of those ideas, and then in some cases the example states that do that. In particular, where able states that dedicate that funding mechanism to early care and education. So I mentioned there the digital advertising tax. Maryland's the only state that currently does that. However, the sales tax, Currently, the way that states have raised revenue through the sales tax for early care and education is just through rate increases. So as I mentioned, South Carolina, 0.25% of their sales taxes is dedicated to early care and education. But other states are looking at expanding the sales tax base to include especially these new economy digital services as they become a greater share of the economy. Becomes more important to make sure that they're captured in our tax system. And so, there's a couple of ways to look at this. In Minnesota and Washington, for example, they expanded it to digital services specifically, so targeting like digital advertising, information technology services, digital social media companies. But it's a more general issue, as I mentioned earlier, that the sales tax base has traditionally only relied on durable goods, only captured durable goods. And so services in general, unless they're specifically enumerated as having the sales tax applied to them, typically aren't taxed. And I have not given a thorough look at Virginia's system yet, but that could be anything from like piano lessons, haircuts, anything that's not like a thing you hold and sell to another person. Typically, unless the state's made a policy decision to tax that thing, the assumption is that it's not taxed. And so when we talk about expanding the base, there's just a couple of ways to look at that. As I mentioned there's some states that have looked at it specifically through the lens of the new economy and like the digital economy. But it's a more general issue in terms of like applying the sales tax to services. I think some of the others that might be worth like mentioning here, although no state's the only DC is the only example of a state of a jurisdiction that's done this. Doing some kind of personal income tax bracket reform. I know Virginia has very low brackets that like the top rate starts very low. Several states have been modifying their brackets, kind of adding brackets on the top, kind of to respect inflation for one thing, as incomes have risen, unless your brackets are tied to inflation in some way, that devalues the dollar, meaning that 15,000 30 years ago and 15,000 today are just two very different things. That said, the only state that's done something like that and then dedicated that revenue to early care and education was DC. But many states are looking at doing something like that. I think, I don't know that it's worth our time for me to go through this whole list and describe them, although I'm happy to do that if that's the pleasure of the audience. For me, I think it makes more sense to kind of open the floor for questions or comments. I'd be happy to pause there to take any thoughts while leaving this slide up to give people time to digest.
Yes, so Bruno, this is Elliot Regenstein, and I'm helping to facilitate the meeting, and just wanted to thank you for that presentation. And as we open it up, just wanted to make a couple more comments for the commission as we get into this, and would hope the commission members are, if you have any notes, questions, or comments, or additional information you want to let, jump in just a minute. Again, just to emphasize that one of the commission's charges is to make recommendations relating to funding stability and sustainability. And so this presentation was meant to provide context for the commission as it fulfills that larger role. It's not our expectation that we're going to try to reach consensus on any specific revenue measures, right, that are up there, but it's more so that the commission understands the national context to inform its broader work on funding sustainability and stability going forward. I also would anticipate, knowing this group, that there's probably a wide range of views about some of these revenue sources in the room, and that's great. And so if folks want to put those views on the table, that's very helpful. But again, just to flag at the outset that we're doing this not to try to strong arm each other, but just to try to inform each other and get a little background and take some temperature. So with that said, I will underscore Bruno's request for any questions or comments or thoughts that people want to share about any of this. And Delegate Coiner, I see you.
Well, it made me think about other programs because I think we also get into our bubble about ways to fund things sometimes. But it made me think as he was going through his list, programs we have today that are centered around tax incentive for people to help families go to college. So I thought of GRASP, right? So GRASP has a program where if you contribute, you get a certain percent of that back as a tax credit for providing scholarships for students who otherwise couldn't go to college. You know, you could really do a similar thing on the flip side for individuals who need assistance with childcare. I only thought about it because it's actually more expensive now to do the childcare piece than it is the higher ed. And I mean, it's not a perfect program, but it's at least one way that we've managed to provide some additional funding for folks for affordability for college.
Yeah, and on that note, you know, horribly underprepared. I should have the list of states. So one, you know, that is a trend that we're seeing for sure. Tax credits for business supported childcare or some kind of tax incentive for business supported childcare. Many states introduced legislation to that effect this year. I know a few of them passed. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure which ones exactly. And I don't want to look like an idiot by giving an answer that's wrong, but I'm happy to provide that information as follow-up to the extent I have it. Just noting though that I'm not an expert on that side of things, so I can happy to share resources and information, but I can only do so much there.
While folks are coming up with their questions for Bruno, I just wanted to add a point of context on the Louisiana situation as Aaron and I were just chatting about being there around that time. Kind of a similar arc here in terms of by 2017, you know, Louisiana had moved to a consolidated system oversight under the Louisiana Department of Education and had about 2 years of rating results coming from the statewide measurement and improvement system, similar to some of the work led by Delegate Coiner and Delegate Bolova. That was at that point at which Louisiana created a commission with a very similar charge around kind of bringing together elected officials from both sides of the aisle, in addition to the work happening at the gubernatorial agency, to kind of think about, you know, what types of financing would we want to pursue as a state. I would note that it was passed in 2017, although it was a few years before there was actual real funds generated towards that. So I just wanted to kind of position this body and a similar one in terms of recognizing the need to have a body like this grapple with how to think about financing, and then, you know, having that that quality measurement in place so you could look at that return on investment, which is very important in what is perceived as a more red state. And then I think the other point B is that it took a couple of years of the commission tackling the very issues that this body has tackled.
Jenna, one other question, and I'm going to try to keep it relatively non-specific, but that my outsider's understanding of the Louisiana tax credit approach was that Louisiana had passed sort of a suite of tax credits that each did different things, and that some of them turned out to be more impactful than others. And that there has been, and again, I don't know the specifics of this either, but my understanding is that a number of states since then have also passed tax credits. And again, some of those have sort of worked better than others, and that there's an emerging understanding of what tax credits can and cannot do.
Absolutely. So there was, prior to the work of the commission in Louisiana, there was earlier a set of school readiness tax credits that included incentives to participate in the quality measurement system, incentives to do well on the quality measurement system, incentives to donate to resource and referral agencies, and then some incentives for employers to contribute. I would say that, and you know, as somebody who spent some time there and then tried to reflect some of those lessons learned and the work that we've been able to do in a public-private partnership here in Virginia, is we recognize that it is more strategic to use a competitive rate to pay your childcare programs rather than to set a very high expectation and then fund you if you get there, but you don't ever have the resources to get there. So that was kind of one that, although it was very effective at getting programs to participate in their quality measurement system, as we rolled out the statewide measurement system, found that that was less effective, that you actually wanted to hold everybody accountable and fund them to be successful, more similar to what we see in other spaces around accountability. We found, again, and you see the same is true, I think, in Arizona, if you use an incentive to donate and it's a 1-for-1 tax credit, that can free up resources. And so that the resource and referral tax credit was used in terms of if Megan gave a donation to an R&R, then she got a 1-for-1 tax credit. And the sort of advantage was that sort of drove resources towards those programs. The disadvantages, from the government's perspective, it was, sometimes perceived to be slightly inefficient in terms of like, why not just give the money directly to the R&Rs. And then the one that did not seem to be effective, and this is, I know they're tackling it with the new employer tax credits, is that it is very hard to get a tax credit for employers, right? Because a lot of it depends on how much actual profit they're making in any given year, and that expenses are also deductible, right? And so that those have been harder to be effective. And I'd say probably 15, 20 years of that tax credit, you still see very low uptake from Louisiana businesses covering the cost of childcare. In sharp contrast, the Policy Institute, with support by Bruno and team, jumped in early on sports betting right around the time that was legalized, and that has been the sort of the biggest win of dollar-wise across these.
Well, and that actually raises another point, Bruno. I don't know if you have data on this, but that some of the states that passed sin taxes, particularly in tobacco, ultimately found that to be a declining source of revenue because, of course, one of the points of the tax was to get people to use less tobacco, and it worked. And then there was less money for early childhood, whereas some of the other sin taxes haven't followed that same arc.
Yeah, I know for sure. So, in speaking to advocates in Arizona, like for sure, I think in nominal terms, the value's fallen from like 200 million to 100 million from the tobacco tax, and so like not even accounting for inflation, right? Like it's halved. And certainly, one thing that I know many advocates are looking for, that Colorado is an example of a state that did this, although it doesn't address the entire issue, to be clear. But one way they've tried to mitigate this is by expanding the tax to like vaping and e-cigarette products, which again, if they're not specifically enumerated, they're typically not taxed as, they don't have that excise tax levied on them unless you change policy to specifically include them. And so Colorado successfully did that. I know Arizona ran legislation to do that this session, and dedicating it to the same fund, the same tobacco based fund that funds early care. I don't believe it passed. I'm not quite sure about that, but yeah, that's certainly an issue. And I would say it's to your point about not all excise taxes follow that arc. I think that's true. Like we haven't yet seen a decline in sports betting taxes, for instance. Marijuana is a little bit more complicated, where like early adopters generated a lot of revenue, then we saw it fall, although I don't know that it's had an impact on consumption the same way that tobacco taxes did. So that's a little bit of a different argument. So yeah, there certainly are, I guess the way I would summarize it is there's certainly trade-offs to any of these tax types, including between different kinds of excise taxes. And yeah, so for example, tobacco is one that you would expect to fall.
Thank you. I think we had a question online, and then, oh no, Delegate Bulova, we'll get to you.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, conversation, that last bit was kind of feeds into the question that I had. And so, we're faced honestly with a lot of groups that would love to have dedicated revenues. So each year we deal with a slew of them. And I think to your point is that dedicated doesn't necessarily equal adequate. And so one of the concerns that I often have about programs that I love and care about is if you take them out of the general sphere or general fund sphere and put them into being funded through a dedicated source, is there the risk of people saying, well, I thought we funded that, and you kind of get locked into a dedicated source, but it's not generating enough revenue or generating it fast enough in order to be able to take care of the issue. And so, Bruno, I guess looking at the states that have adopted special mechanisms for funding early childhood care and education, does that generally equal that they are consistently funding the need, or are you seeing a gap in there where you still have a problem that just because it's dedicated doesn't mean that it's being adequately funded?
Yeah, I mean, so want to again clarify that, in terms of the cost side of things, the fiscal mapping side of things, I'm not an expert, but I will say yes, I don't think that any of these dedicated funds meet the needs that we have out there. They're just one way to help us get closer to meeting that need. To the question or to the comment, to the point of that, maybe it's used as a argument against using other kinds of funding. I wouldn't be surprised that if that argument is out there, although I would say I don't know that that's played out in practice. In most of these cases, we see kind of the other direction. So it starts with like one source of funding, and then the number of funding sources expand as the needs grow. To be clear, each state will have a different experience, and I'm not saying that that's a universal experience, but I would say probably more common that it's something that starts like a trend, starts people talking about it, starts talking generates more interest in finding funding, is really more of my take on how it's played out. That's just my anecdotal experience there, to be honest. I wouldn't claim to know enough about the nitty-gritty details in each of these states to say for sure, but that's my bird's eye view perspective.
I would add, in response to Delegate Bulova's question, and Bruno drawing on a conversation we had before you joined us, that of course many of these states don't have a funding formula or other mechanism to identify what the actual need is, so that for them quantifying the gap, again, as Bruno said, I think in many of these states there's a sense that there is a gap, but that they don't know exactly how large it is because they haven't worked to quantify it.
Yeah, I think the other really important piece, if you reflect back on some of the findings from Delegate Bulova this morning, is that if you think about whether it's the increase and the increase in tobacco consumption, if you think about, the increase in some of these other things over time, that none of them would necessarily match, like what is, for example, what we've mapped out for Virginia's growth rate over time, right? And so it's the idea is, it's a combination of available revenue and the system being able to deploy the revenue, to eligible kids and working families, right, over a big system over time. And what Virginia has that some of these other states may not have is that kind of year-over-year growth in which the supply was responding to the resources. There were more eligible families who wanted this, and that rate would look different from any kind of mapping of the kind of the growth here. So your true north still needs to be, Delegate, okay, what is that need? And, to what extent does that demand reflect how much the system can grow in any given year too? And that is not necessarily line up with any of the kind of dedicated revenue sources.
I had a similar question as yours, Delegate Bulova. I mean, you're a doctor. What about New Mexico? So if we're talking about which ones of these are efficient, which of them are meeting the need, and maybe I just read this in a newspaper article, so it might not be accurate, but the comment was, we have universal preschool childcare now in New Mexico, thanks to gas revenues. Anybody know?
Yeah, I'll start with Bruno. I know some of that story, but if Bruno, if you want to get us started, and I'll try to fill in.
Oh man, like I said, I really am so ignorant of anything that's not specific to how much money and how. But I will say that I know this came up in a conversation. The question of and whether that means it needs to be free. And I don't know where New Mexico landed on that question. I know other states are grappling with what the meaning of universal is. That's the only tidbit I have to offer there. I'm sorry.
So to try to add to that, so New Mexico, as I understand it, has like a land grant permanent fund, which was essentially created with oil and gas revenue. And for years it had been used for certain purposes, but that in a state with relatively low revenues and with some of the, consistently sort of ranking in the bottom 5 for child outcomes, there had been ongoing pressure to use more of that permanent fund for early childhood purposes. And that there was, in fact, a coordinated advocacy campaign focused on essentially electing legislators who would vote for that. And I believe it may have taken even a constitutional amendment, but that you had a governor who came in with early childhood as a really high priority, and you had what amounted to like a mountain of money just sitting there potentially to be tapped, and that combination led to the outcome we've seen in New Mexico today. So, I mean, with full credit to the folks in New Mexico who made that happen, if you don't start with the large permanent fund to be tapped, you're then talking about, if you're going to do that, you've got to create some new revenue source.
Yeah.
That's part of why it was possible in New Mexico, is that it did not require raising sort of the day-to-day revenue and taxes that they were charging people.
To the points that were made earlier, though, did they have a benchmark? Did they have any formula for really figuring out, is this really enough to cover everything we want to do?
So I can kind of answer that question a little bit. I know that prior to the creation of the fund itself, before they expanded the land grant permanent fund's use to this early care fund, they did create like an Office of Early Child Care and like went through strategic planning process. I don't know how many of the specific questions of adequacy, cost, all that it answered, but I do know they at least did some pre-work to build a target as to, what they wanted to do before they like formally built a target of what they wanted to do before they went for it.
Yes, and so I think that's an important point, John. So they did sort of consolidate governance. They created a new state agency rather than locating it at an existing state agency. Their work, not necessarily reflected in the media, but their work is similar to the work in Virginia, but incremental. So we've been watching very closely as a kind of a state with some similarities, I think some political differences, but some structural similarities. They have also moved to cost of quality. So they look at sort of similar to the way that Virginia does, look at what are the quality expectations across their public-private system and how do they fund them to mix it. I think similar to Virginia, we're not interested in just kind of universal pre-K, but we're really interested in the public-private mix. They have a lot of tribal nations there. They have a lot of interest in family childcare, and they're kind of rural and less resource communities. And so kind of the idea was that it needed to be a public-private mix. I think, as Elliot noted, having a large pool of money made it easier to kind of lead with a commitment. They're not there overnight, right? And so again, they're going to be subject to this very same question or grappling with now. How do you sort of grow at the right rate? How do you grow in response to parental demand? How do you make sure the dollars follow children? And then how do you ultimately make sure that there's accountability for those dollars? So I think some states are going to be much more politically interested in an upfront commitment. I think you're going to see in other states a more sort of desire to tie this to things like economic development, growth over time, and sort of being able to see it there. You might end up in similar places, but there's kind of understanding kind of the one thing that they have done well is to understand the intricacies of their system in the same way that I would argue Virginia's probably going to take a different approach, but does have that same level of deep understanding of its public-private system.
Other questions, comments, reactions, reflections?
My perspective would be at least somewhat along the lines of what Delegate Bulova expressed concerned about. I generally don't like dedicated funds. I prefer using the general fund for a lot of things. I think it makes sense. And if something is a priority, it ought to go through the general fund. We continue to see surplus after surplus in the Commonwealth and the general fund as well. So I do not like the idea of another revenue source going that way. So that's just my perspective.
Now, if I'll just note that a few states have, you mentioned ongoing surpluses year over year. I mean, we're seeing that's true of many states recently, and we're seeing states like dedicating that surplus revenue to create a fund of this sort. Just throwing that out there. I respect your perspective. I just wanted to give you some additional information along those lines that that's essentially how Montana got their early care fund started, is they noticed we've had surpluses for 5, 6, 7 years now. Plenty of money in the rainy day fund. Seems like this might be a good use. So just wanted to throw that perspective out there.
Other questions, comments, or thoughts?
I have a question for Bruno. In terms of, and I know this goes back and starts with South Carolina, but to our delegate and senator's point around accountability for these funds, like how do you make sure, that there a certain amount is spent each year? How do you know that there's a return on investment? I think part of what, and maybe there's an inclination to sort of focus on the state general fund, is that, then sort of year over year, you're revisiting what is the highest and best use of these dollars, right? And that allows you to make that determination while you can sort of see what is the return from the prior year's dollars, right? And if they're divided over dedicated revenue sources, maybe there is not that same clarity of being able to put things side by side and to kind of engage in that prioritization process, right? That takes into account return on investment. I'd be curious to hear from you, Bruno, in terms of now that we've had 2 decades of this type of work, are there more or less effective ways that states have sort of held these different vehicles accountable for return on investment, for addressing adequacy, as Delegate Bulova noted, and really kind of making sure that this is still the highest and best use in a way that I think Senator Sudoan noted is a real concern here in Virginia.
Yeah, no, totally understandable concern. And I'd say, yes, there's a variety of different ways that states do this that range from more accountability to less. I would say in more recent years, the model that's been kind of prevalent is having some kind of special advisory board or commission that governs the use of the fund. And usually that's composed of administration officials, Senate and House officials, and then, providers, sometimes parents and other experts in the field. Occasionally, for example, in Nebraska, because it's a public-private partnership, business also has representation on these oversight boards, these management boards. And so, yeah, that's the most typical way, is that there's a special commission that oversees the work. Sometimes it's housed within an administrative department. So there's different ways that states do that. But I'd say the way that's kind of trending is that model of having a board that has representation from various different branches, as well as the public.
Thank you. Anything else that folks have? All right. Well, I want to express appreciation, Bruno, for coming. I know I believe someone asked in the chat about whether the slides would be available, which I believe they will be. So we will make sure to share those out and make sure that everyone's got a copy if they want. And appreciate everybody's questions and conversation on that topic. I believe there was a question on our earlier topic. Before I hand it over to Delegate Bulova to manage public comment and wrap us up, I believe that we had a comment that we didn't get to on one of our earlier agenda items. And
Yes.
Rebecca is nodding at me, so that's great.
Yes, we actually have two comments and questions that I think are ultimately for Jenna's response. So I'm going to start with Belinda Ostrops, and I'm just going to read these verbatim from the comment section. So I think we are missing so much data, not to mention the children we are missing. I work in a school and we have had several children show up in sometimes the second grade that have never been to school or a daycare. Does the state have a better way of tracking children in the state?
So thank you, Belinda. That's a great question, and one that we've been grappling with. I think it's honestly a nice segue from our prior conversation. When you think about the most important return on investment in early childhood, which is for those longitudinal outcomes. So, we school is not compulsory in Virginia until kindergarten, and even the law is flexible there. And so that, our school divisions are really responsible once kids are sort of kindergarten or older age for ensuring that kids are attending. And it is always a choice for early childhood, right? It is not compulsory. We recognize the positive outcomes if we can find children earlier. That's true for our children with developmental delays and disabilities who might be eligible for services as early, as birth or 2.5 for the different parts of federal funding. And we have been working really hard to think about how we show what Belinda is describing anecdotally across the board, that if we can have positive experiences for kids earlier, that can make a difference in their outcomes. And we also recognize that there might be scenarios where kids start in one community in Virginia and end up in another, right? Where you kind of come to second grade in Belinda's community and you started in my community. So our work around building out VQB5 and LinkB5, which is that underlying database that captures down to the classroom level kids' experiences across the system, has been a 5-year work in progress. This year, this fall, we have launched VA Connects, which basically connects all of the experiences that kids are having birth to 5 down to the classroom level. So it's not just a kid associated with a particular funding source, but it's actually saying this child is in this classroom with this experience this year, and then this child is in another classroom with this experience the following year. That's partly why we're able to give you that kind of within your data about turnover earlier. And we can actually, over time, look at how the kids in those different settings do. Our parents have an ability to opt in or opt out, but we also capture which kids are in those classrooms, right? And then ultimately, when those kids come into kindergarten, that data is linked with VKRP, which is our Virginia Kindergarten Readiness Program, and VALS, which is our literacy screener. So we know, we're sending out some detail on this, but there are roughly about 800,000 kids in that system right now. And we will, over time, be able to, just as Belinda described, kind of take a second grader and understand what experiences that second grader may or may not have had, kind of leading up to early elementary. And hopefully we'll also be able to turn around and sort of say to the delegates and the senators, hey, we know kids that had this experience. When you made this investment, it led to this outcomes: more kindergarten ready, more on level in first grade, less at risk of not reading in second grade, right? More on level in third grade and beyond. So it has taken the greater part of 6 to 7 years to build that, but we do have that system in place and can begin to, in a way that will protect children's privacy, but also enable us to better serve kids and families and to demonstrate that impact to our elected officials.
And this second question is from Simon Fiscus. What costs do states apply early childhood funding to beyond salaries? Many also support staff training, medical expenses, classroom materials, and family subsidies. Still, early childhood staff face rising classroom behaviors, often multiple daily incidents of defiance, aggression, property destruction, and elopement, plus increased assessments, certification demands, and emotionally charged parent confrontations. These challenges are compounded by mandated multiple days of testing to now pass medical training and an 8-hour USDA meal compliance requirement. The added strain of school shooting preparedness, even in preschool settings, deepens the emotional toll. And with fewer than 20% of private child care providers in Virginia offering medical insurance, staff often lack support to manage those stressors. Where else, beyond additional funding for wages, can we move the needle to improve turnover rates in a more sustainable way?
Thank you, Simon. And again, I think about Delegate Coiner's story from earlier, whether it's from Delegate Coiner or hearing it from Simon. This work is so much more than a slot, right? And I just think that, it's a nice bookend to hear that story from Carrie and to hear from Simon about the real challenges day in, day out that our early childhood educators are facing, and the difference that they can make in a mom's life, right? In a working family's life by doing that incredible work. Simon lays out the importance, and you heard Delegate Pulova talk about this earlier, of really accounting for the cost to provide this service. You've heard us talk before in this body around the old way that you've done rates, which looks at price and really is just a reflection of the wealth of a community, is not the best way for a state to say, what are priorities? How do we think about what we want to see what is the highest and best use of this dollar? What accountability we want for that dollar? And then to say, okay, here's how we're going to fund the service, right? So that public and private providers can access that dollar and deliver that service. And Simon described some of the things that go into accounting for that cost of quality and also why we need to adjust it. So Simon asked, what percentage are wages? We shared with the funding formula work group that about 70% of the cost of quality is wages. So if you ask why, to John's question earlier, why is childcare more expensive? It's because K-12 wages have gone up, right? We've had inflation and we've needed to also raise the cost or how much we're sort of accounting for childcare educator compensation. There's also other costs. We've heard a lot about liability insurance from providers, right? Which we might need to there's maybe a new training required by USDA. This body, as Delegate Coiner noted earlier, is looking to streamline those regulations, right? And we would then be able to kind of account for that in our cost of quality. But what Simon described, I think, is the importance of why you need to be kind of looking at and re-benchmarking with some regularity. Remember, K-12 does this every 2 years, but re-benchmarking to look at what are the actual costs that private providers are facing and making sure that the state is aware of that and then offering that competitive rate. And because it is much more than just compensation, as Simon noted. Thank you, Simon, for your comment.
All right. I think any other questions before we go into wrap up? All right, then Delegate Bulova, I'll turn it to you to bring us home.
Thank you very much, Elliot. And so we've come to the final part of our meeting, which is the opportunity for public comment. So does anybody want to have their 3 minutes of fame? No, I'm not seeing anybody step up to the plate. But anyways, with that, we will proceed to adjournment. I do want to thank Bruno very much for being here. That was a really insightful presentation. And I want to thank all the commission members for a very rich discussion, a lot of topics covered, but I think it's very, very useful in terms of pushing this issue even forward, particularly as we approach the 2026 session. Our next meeting will be October 22nd. It will be at the Williams Mullen Center right here in downtown Richmond. So we look forward to seeing everybody there. Is there anybody else who has anything for the good of the order today? And seeing none, nope, we just did public comment. Yeah, we did. Yeah. They said nice things about you that I got up here and talked about Senator Bill Stanley and very good. All right. Seeing none, we stand adjourned. Thank you very much.